Hi, my name is Chris Parkhurst. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I'm also the host of the Documentary Life podcast, a show that spans 140 episodes, has been downloaded in over 135 countries, and I've been producing for about 5 years. I decided to put each and every episode up here onto YouTube to sort of expand the audience, and as we say in the show, maybe inspire and inform some more doc filmmakers, hopefully like yourself. In the episodes, you may find some older, maybe outdated URLs, in particular any of the documentary filmmaking courses that we do offer online. If you have any questions about the URLs, simply look in the show notes on this page, here on this YouTube page, and that'll be able to take you where you need to go to. Other than that, I hope you enjoy the show, and it's great to have another listener to the Documentary Life. Have a great day. Microphone check, 1, 2. CC, hello and welcome. CC, hello and welcome.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
She sells seashells by the seashore. She sells seashells by the seashore. There we go, rolling.
I think a lot of times, at best, music in a film is very subliminal. It doesn't grab your attention, it just enhances the mood in a way that you mightn't even notice. In many cases, I feel like that's when film music works best. That potential is there, that fusion of the music with the picture really can elevate something to a new level.
Hello and welcome to the Documentary Life, a show that sets out to inspire and inform you on how to best live and lead your own documentary life. I am your host, Chris G. Parkhurst, and this is episode number 37. And it is brought to you by Barong Films, proud creators of documentary film, the Documentary Life podcast, and the Documentary Academy, our industry-changing A to Z documentary filmmaking program that will transform you into the documentary filmmaker that you've always wanted to be. Find out more at thedocumentarylife.com/academy. Now, I'm recording this segment from the US, where Steph and the kids and we've relocated back here from the UK. Until we move into our house next week, we're residing in my parents' RV, if you can believe it. So if you happen to, hear a stray car, truck, or a lawnmower, you'll forgive me. The walls are definitely pretty thin in this thing. Now, today's show, it's very much dedicated to the often overlooked craft of original music or score for your documentary film. Not only am I a filmmaker, but I'm also a self-professed music geek. Anyone who knows me knows that other than my film gear, just about the only other material possessions that I own, they pretty much revolve around music. Film and music. Music and film. I really can't get enough. Now, anyone who has listened to at least a handful of episodes of TDL knows that the first documentary that I directed and produced on my own was a film called Journey to Kathmandu. It's a film I reference obviously all the time in the show. I'd worked on a number of documentaries prior to this, but this was the first one that I could truly call my own, right? And most of you know that it's a film that I shot in Nepal back in 2009. And most of you also know that it took a sometimes rather painfully long time to finish, like over 4 years. What you may not know is that it wasn't until over 3 years into the editing process and many different versions and cuts of the film that I was finally able to lay down original score to my visuals. What transpired as I began to lay the tracks into the various sections of the film, it quite literally blew my mind. After looking at, this footage over and over and rearranging in 1,000 different, oftentimes frustrating ways, once I put the original music in the timeline, put it in place, I suddenly saw and maybe more importantly felt my film in an entirely new, fresh, and really in a very exciting way. And I'm not being overly dramatic when I say that the score for Journey to Kathmandu, it changed the landscape of my film. You'd have to go back into the archives of TDL, it was episode number 4, to find a show where I talked about this subject of score for one's doc. The topic for the episode was actually inspired by an email from a doc lifer by the name of Kristen, and she was out of Buffalo, New York, a city, as many of you know, very close to where I grew up, and a highly underrated city, I might add. The show was inspired by an emailed question, or her emailed question, and at the time, I didn't really have a dedicated segment for this, right? So I was occasionally opening shows by reading an email from a listener. Of course, now, that's morphed into an actual segment of its own called the Doc Lifer Community Question of the Week. In any case, as I said, the show was dedicated to the subject of original music for your documentary film. Well, I'd like to do something similar with this show, only since we've expanded the show quite a bit since that episode, we'll also be hearing from someone who makes music for films for a living, as we welcome musician and score composer Peter Broderick onto the show. I'd been looking forward to talking with Peter for a long time, not only because I'd wanted to do a show dedicated to the art of film composition, but because I'd been listening to Peter for a few years, and I loved his music. His original score for the documentary film Confluence, it's still one of my fave soundtracks. It's a piece of work that I'll listen to often when I'm doing writing. In fact, I'll be playing bits and pieces from this particular soundtrack throughout the program today. I'd highly recommend checking it out on maybe Spotify, or if you're a music fan like myself, you can order a copy of the CD, MP3, or you can have what I have, which is a vinyl copy of the soundtrack. So after a short break, we'll begin today's episode by revisiting episode number 4, where I answered Doc Lifer Kristen's email question about the original score for my film, Journey to Kathmandu. I think it's a really nice and appropriate way to tee up what will be an awesome conversation with musician Peter Broderick. I'll also quickly add that there will be no Doc Lifer Community Question of the Week for this episode. Kristen's email will basically be the Doc Lifer Community Question of the Week. But I would like to encourage you to keep writing me with your comments and suggestions, doc industry requests, by dropping me a line at chris@barangfilms.com. That's chris@barangfilms.com. I've been getting more and more of these, and it's truly, honestly, it's shaping the flavor and the feel of the show, which is what I'd intended for this segment to be in the first place. Already, your suggestions have brought about show topics and industry guests, so great work doing that, and let's keep it going. Again, my email is chris@barangfilms.com. Enjoy today's episode of The Documentary Life. This one's been a long time coming. Remember, film and music. Music and film. Did you know that each and every episode of The Documentary Life has its own show notes? I mean, I'm sure you've heard me mention them on an episode, but have you ever actually gone and checked them out? Because they often have some really nice supplemental materials that go in conjunction with that week's show. There are behind-the-scenes stills of filmmakers and their work. There are video clips. There's additional information on a show's topic, links to mentioned websites or resources, just to name a few of the things that you'll find within show notes. So if you haven't been regularly going to view show notes after listening to a show, you're actually missing out on materials that will further the week's discussion, thereby helping you best live and lead your own documentary life. So after today's show, go to thedocumentarylife.com and start delving into show notes for today's as well as past episodes. It's just another way to be a part of our Doc Lifer community. There are plenty of places online to learn how to do things like split the audio signals coming into your camera, or how to animate some of your still photos, or get some great tips on lighting your interview, many blogs, YouTube videos, and of course podcasts where you can quickly grab an answer to a tech-related question. But what if there was one place where you could learn from beginning to end how to make a documentary film and how to become a doc filmmaker, how to raise money and build an audience for your doc, how to form strategic partnerships and launch your doc out into the world, and perhaps even, if you can imagine, make some money from it? Well, there is such a place, and it's called the Documentary Academy. Steph and I took 2 years to build out this comprehensive resource that takes you step by step from story creation and pre-production all the way to post-production, launch, and distribution. The Academy takes you through your doc filmmaking journey as your most confident, active, strategic, creative, focused, and articulate self. It is a step-by-step guide to empowerment in the documentary filmmaking world. We know what we have in the Documentary Academy. Now it's up to you to discover what you have as a doc filmmaker. Do that today by heading over to thedocumentarylife.com/academy.
faces in the paper, in the story of your life.
Peter Broderick, welcome to the documentary Life. I'm really happy to have you on the show. We've had, and when I first reached out to you via email, I may have mentioned to you, we'd had a number of types of guests on the show, whether talking about, fundraising for documentary films. We'd had a lot of doc filmmakers. We'd had, authors who had written books around funding. We'd covered a lot of topics, is what I'm saying, Peter. But one of the topics, other than an episode I had done myself sort of about the importance of scoring for your documentary film, we certainly hadn't had a conversation with someone a musician who has done that themselves. So I'm eager to speak with you today about that. So welcome to the program, Peter.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Pleasure.
For someone who may be unfamiliar with your work, Peter, why don't you give us a bit of a description of your music? I mean, is it you hear these terms, right? Modern classical, neoclassical, folk. Where is it that you feel like you fit in as a musician?
Yeah, well, I have to say I've always had such a hard time describing music in words, and that's actually one thing that is a big challenge when I'm working with a film, because you're working with people and you're using words to describe music. Okay, I want something sad, I want something beautiful, but all these things are so subjective. It can often take a while before you kind of understand each other, and so I've always struggled in describing my own music, and also because I have such a broad interest in
right.
I'm really just so curious about all different types of music. So, and I love to play lots of different instruments myself. So, I've made everything from folk music to instrumental classical type music to experiments in hip hop and rock and roll type stuff, and more avant-garde drone based ambient music, things like that. So I still would love to try all the things I haven't yet.
Yeah,
so,
right. Well, and if someone wanted to check out your music, it would take one sort of check through Spotify to really see the types of the material that you're doing. I'm just using Spotify as an example because you can access a number of your works there, and what you're describing holds true where you're really playing to a number of different genres.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've just always loved doing that, and each kind of genre of music has brought me to different places as well. Obviously, with the film world, the sort of ambient sound design kind of what's the word I'm looking for?
Well, I mean, you're describing sort of, really it's this textural, environmental, music that's accompanying it's accompanying visuals, right?
Yeah, and in the case of a documentary, a lot of the times the music will have dialogue over the top as well.
Right.
So a lot of that music has to be pretty subliminal, and so that's the kind of style that's been picked up for me most in the film and also the dance world. I've done quite a lot of music for contemporary dance.
Yes.
So,
I had been listening to your music for a while now, and I kind of as a filmmaker myself, I kind of geek out a bit on film compositions and scoring, and I'm also just a big kind of music geek myself, and so I've been listening to your music for a while. But it's crazy. I've lived in Portland, off and on for the past 2 decades. We're currently in the UK right now, my wife and I, but I was unaware until, actually starting to really research you very recently that, oh, wow, Peter spent an awful lot of time in Portland. And in fact, he spent most of his time growing up in Oregon, and you were around bands which I'd, either seen perform or had listened to, like Loch Lomond, Norfolk and Western, Horse Feathers, and M. Ward. And so it's crazy how that happens.
You've probably seen me on stage then.
I'm sure I have. I'm sure I've seen you play. I'm sure we have mutual friends. Portland, it's a pretty small town. Well, I mean, let's get right into the some of the stuff, the composing for film work that you've done. How did you first get started composing for film? Did someone approach you? Was it something that you actively sought out yourself? How did that first happen?
almost all the projects that I've worked on were people that found their way to me.
Nice.
But it's interesting because one of the first solo records that I released, was a record called Float, and that
Float's
album,
great. I love that album. It's wonderful.
It's primarily instrumental, piano-based compositions, but if you listen to it, it comes across, at least I think, and this was my intention for it, that it would come across as a soundtrack in a way. There's a melodic theme there that kind of winds its way back, it recurs throughout the duration of the album.
Right.
And that's something that happens a lot in film music. And I had been inspired by a lot of film soundtracks myself before I made the record. But although it wasn't created for a specific film, I really wanted it to sound like it could be a soundtrack. And I think, when people heard that, they picked up on, hey, this could be music for a film. And,
absolutely.
And that was when people started reaching out to me. And some people have just taken those songs and placed them in a film, and others have asked me, hey, can you make a new score tailored to this specific picture? So, ever since those records came out, 2007, 2008, I've had a steady stream of requests for that kind of thing.
And that can lead us to a film a documentary film that I think is a great film, and I appreciate so much about it. I think the storyline is incredibly intriguing. It's shot beautifully, and the music that you created for it was something that I instantly took a liking to. It's the kind of atmospheric type of scoring that I love. And I'm speaking of the film Confluence. Confluence was this documentary that took place in Lewiston, Idaho, of course, which is not really all that far from where you and I resided for much of our lives.
Yeah.
And it's a documentary about sort of the several cases of missing or murdered young girls in the 80s, all of which sort of seem to lead back, to this one man, right? And who has never actually been formally charged even to this day. And the film is a beautiful film, and the score is equally beautiful. I would love to hear a bit about, and I'm kind of leading you on here, Peter, because I read a bit about how this came to be, including your relocation to Germany. I have to hear that story because it's absolutely fascinating with the piano story the piano store and really sort of a confluence of things in your own life that were happening that led you to this. Tell us that story of how the film came, or how the music came to be for the documentary Confluence.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the director, one of the directors, Vernon Lott, he usually works as a partnership with his partner, Jennifer Anderson. They've made several films together. But Vernon reached out to me, and it turned out that he was either a childhood or teenage friend with an old bandmate of mine from Portland, Oregon. So there was a small world connection already, but Vernon had stumbled across my own music and was working on this film and asked me if I would be interested in creating the score for it. And I just got a great vibe off Vernon right away, and he sent me a decent offer. He came up with, he scraped together as much as he could on a low budget project to actually offer me something to make it worth my while.
Right.
So I got on board right away, and the amazing thing was that almost every single thing that I made and sent to Vernon, he just said yes right away.
Oh, wow.
And it's so rare that happens in the scoring world, at least in my experience. So I really felt that trust from him in a way, and that really got my creative juices flowing. When there's not trust in a project, it can be very challenging to navigate through it. But with Vernon in particular, I've worked on a number of projects with him now, and I've always found it really, really great. But yeah, and at that time I had just moved to Berlin, And I was lucky enough to be living above a piano store, and the man who had the piano store gave me the keys to the place. So after hours, I would just go in there in the middle of the night and play all these different pianos. And a lot of the recordings for that soundtrack took place there, in this kind of eerie, dark empty piano store.
Peter, what are the differences as a musician? What's a difference in the process of, say, writing music for yourself and writing for a film?
When you're working for a film, you really you're trying to, oftentimes in film, like, people have been working on it for years before they start getting in touch with the composer.
That's right,
so they've been involved in this whole world intimately for a long time, and it can be very I've had experiences in the past where, I started to make music and filmmakers got almost offended because it wasn't what they had in mind. Meanwhile, I'm just doing my best to understand where they're coming from. Well, sometimes that's come to a head, and I've known filmmakers that have gone through 4 or 5 composers all doing a soundtrack, and then in the end deciding to use no music at all. So,
oh, wow.
It's but in other cases, it's I don't know what it is really. Maybe Vernon just maybe it was that small world connection we had, that we knew someone in common or something. Maybe he just really, really liked the music of mine that he'd heard and felt that he could trust me. And but for whatever reason, that one went a bit smoother. But it's always a very different process than creating something on my own accord. Making music for a film is, you're often given very specific direction for it, and I'll often end up revising something as per someone's request, and in the end, it's kind of more like a collaboration sometimes. It's not just your own idea, but it's your own idea matched with someone else's vision. So,
well, with that in mind, that last statement, I mean, how do you feel, Peter? How do you feel? What's the importance, or what is the impact, say, of your music to a film? How do you view that as a composer? What is the impact of your music to a film?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, at best, music in a film is very subliminal. It doesn't grab your attention. It just enhances the mood in a way that you mightn't even notice. And I in many cases, I feel like that's when film music works best. Maybe there's a moment or two when it jumps out and kind of grabs you, but I really appreciate music that can sort of go unnoticed in that way.
Right.
And that's something that I definitely find a challenge, because when I make music, I like to make music that sounds good, and you hear it, you think, oh, what a beautiful song, and so it's kind of counterintuitive to try and make music that's not going to grab someone's ears, and I have to admit, in a lot of time, I've found it hard to be satisfied with the way my music fits in a film. Like in the case with Vernon, he was very reassuring, and I felt through his own assurance that the music fit the film. But in some cases, I really wasn't sure sometimes.
Interesting.
If it was adding to the mood, or if it was too dramatic, sometimes things, music can make things just a little too dramatic for my personal taste. So
right.
It's a fine line there.
It is a fine line. And how do you approach that? I mean, did you have moments where you felt like, it sounds like you had a really nice working relationship with Vernon. Were there times where you felt like, hey, you know what? I feel like this is kind of a little bit heavy-handed, or this is overdoing the mood that you're trying to create here. Can we pull back on it? Did you feel like you're able to do that with a director, or is your approach, you know what, I'm going to give the director what he or she wants. It's up to them to decide how they use it.
Right. Yeah, it just depends on the person.
Yeah.
With Vernon, like you said, I felt very lucky in that project that we just kind of things just flowed, and there was I'm actually remembering now, there was one thing that I really thought fit the film that he didn't think fit, but he was so by that point we just trusted each other so much that I had no problem just saying to him, like, look, if you don't think that fits, that's fine by me. I'll come up with something else. And so in that case, it worked really well. But yeah, I mean, I had another case years ago. It wasn't a documentary film, but it was a film that I was working on, and it was so dramatic. Like, the director ended up being fired by the producers, and then they hired another composer, and it's such a nightmare. So yeah, there's such a huge variety of experience there.
Yeah, welcome to shining a little bit of a light on the industry there, Peter. I'll tell you.
Yeah.
The experience that I had with my first documentary, Journey to Kathmandu, I had approached two Portland composers by the name of Samuel Ross and Jared Jensen. And they wrote music for Journey to Kathmandu, and as you alluded to earlier, this is so deep in the process for me. At that point I'd worked on the film for 4 years, and was close to really. I mean, I had a fine cut, and I was close to picture lock.
So let me ask you: did you have temp music in there?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I did have some temp music. Now, it's a great question, especially for my audience, because you'll hear a lot of, and I'm going to love to hear your opinion on this. You'll hear a lot of back and forth about temp music. I came up in the industry as an editor, and so I would use temp music. I used to use temp music quite a bit. And then at some point, when you then reached out to have original composition made, it's as if you risk becoming too close to what you have created that intertwines with that temp music you have. So on one hand, it might be a good sort of guidepost if your composer wants to have some idea of some sort of sounds that you're looking for, or atmospherics. On the other hand, what composer wants to be told, here, just create this.
Yeah. And not to mention the fact that, when someone's working on a film and they put in some temp music, and you spend hours and hours, countless times looking over that film, that temp music becomes embedded for you. It's a part of the film.
Right. That's right.
And I really, it's like the musician who gets caught up on how their demo sounds, and then they go to the studio, and the studio recording never quite captures the magic of the demo. It's like, if you put in the time and listen to something that much, or view it with that music there, it's gonna become a part of it for you, And
that's right.
I feel that that's just intrinsic to that way of working.
One of the things that I really, having worked on the film at that point for 4 hours, and let's restate that, for 4 years. Maybe to some it looks like 4 hours. Having worked on that for four years, and then starting to get some of the music that came in from Sam and Jared, I have to say that it for the first time, probably in like 3 of those 4 years, I had a total new sense and new, really, inspiration for my film. And I truly believe that their score, it doesn't merely enhance my film. I felt like it transformed it and took it to an entirely new place that I had not seen. Maybe I'd certainly maybe hoped for it, but it truly, their score transformed my film, and I am so thankful for that experience. And so I feel like, while I understand what you're saying about creating scores for music and how maybe it should be understated, I feel like you're underselling yourself a little bit, in my opinion, at least, in my humble opinion, because I just think score is just such an integral part of a film now.
Wow. Well, and I'm so glad to hear you say that about your own experience with that score in your film. I guess I don't always know sometimes how, and I think you might be someone who is particularly interested in music. I do think there are filmmakers out there. There are some filmmakers out there that don't have, they're not quite as focused on that part of it.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
but yeah, it's great to hear you say that just how important the music was to you, and I think any composer that works with you should feel very lucky in that sense. But I think that potential is there, like that potential is there. That fusion of the music with the picture really can elevate something to a new level. Definitely.
Peter, what's the best way for a filmmaker to approach someone like you? How do they approach you? How do they ask you? Do they put an offer right up front, or and then you can answer with what they should be maybe supplying with you with afterwards as terms of inspirational materials?
Yeah, well, generally people will write to me first, and they might introduce themselves and their project a little bit.
Kind of a query.
Yeah, and then they kind of gauge interest, and then if I write back and let them know I'm interested. Usually, in the beginning it wasn't like this, but nowadays the first question I ask is, what's the timeline and what's the budget?
Yes.
Just purely because as a freelance musician, this is how I make my living. Like the timeline and the budget helps me know if it's feasible at all, and I don't want to waste someone's time making them think I might be able to do it if I simply can't.
Yeah, if you simply can't. Right.
So I always ask right up front, just to be clear, communication wise. It doesn't mean that I don't do projects that have no budget. I still do sometimes if the timing is right and if the project kind of hits home for me somewhere.
Right.
But yeah, it's the best. It always helps to know that someone is familiar with my work in a sense. I hate to say it in a way that like need my ego to be stroked before I get on board, but it helps foster that sense of trust I was talking about. If someone writes to you and they give you a specific example, like, hey, Chris, I really loved that scene at the end of your film, and then they go on to say, I have this project. It kind of draws you in.
Sure it does. It absolutely does.
It really helps to have, and it makes me feel like, oh, I want to go check out this person's work.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't have to be an egotistical thing. It can just be a mutual appreciation, really.
Say someone has hired you, Peter, and it's a first-time filmmaker, and they've hired you on a project, and you've created some music, and that this filmmaker feels like, wow, this is. I mean, it's great, but this isn't where I saw the direction of this going. It really doesn't fit the mood for these particular scenes. What's the best way? How would you recommend having that experience? How would you recommend we filmmakers? How do we tell you guys this? Well, what's the best way we can communicate that?
Right. Well, it's always helpful to be constructive.
Yeah.
What really doesn't help is to just shoot things down.
Right.
And oftentimes that's the impulse when you feel like a great resistance to something. If someone sends you music and you're like, oh no, this isn't it. My best advice is to sit on it for a day or two first.
Yeah.
Think about a more constructive way to approach it, and keep in mind as well that maybe this particular composer maybe it's not the right fit. That's always a possibility too. But you wouldn't want to threaten something like that. Like, you need to fix this or else you're not the right composer.
Yeah, right.
Or I guess just be true to yourself and try and have a respect for what the person has taken time to make for you. Because that respect is what's going to foster and inspire them to do good work for you.
Well, and it's funny. I mean, you know how this is with music, Peter. How many times have we heard a piece of music in our lives, and maybe it didn't initially grab us, and then we heard it the next day or the next day after that, and suddenly it starts to kind of find its way into you, and then suddenly you love it at some point, right? And I think that can happen with our films too, right? I mean, like you said, we as the filmmakers, we've been spending so much time with this footage, and whether it's shooting it, whether it's interviews, whether it's editing the footage, and we have our sort of our own vision and our own ideas, and we see it and hear it a certain way. And oftentimes we're bringing the composer in so late in the process that I think it's a very natural thing as for the filmmaker to maybe not initially feel connected to the music that's sent to them. But as you're suggesting,
Absolutely.
if you give it some time, and it really does need some time, then make your assessment after you've given it some time and worked with the footage for a bit.
Absolutely. And that right there, Chris, is key. I think just what you said, oftentimes on first listening, something just kind of goes in one ear and out the other. And if you can get past that initial rejection, or maybe whatever,
A defensive feeling to it.
The defensive feeling, if you can get past that, you really might surprise yourself sometimes if you just give something a little bit more of a chance. Watch it 4 or 5 times. Show it to a couple friends. Do some A/B with the original, whatever temp music you might have had.
Yeah, right.
And the new thing, I really that's something like I would be so happy for people that I'm working with if they can experience it a few times before getting back to me with feedback. I think that'd be really helpful.
Something you had mentioned earlier about payment and budgets and this sort of this idea of, there are obviously bigger budgets and there are smaller budgets and there are little to no budgets. An established musician like yourself, Peter, what is your response, or how do you handle the response to someone who maybe approaches you with very little or no budget for music for their film? But they approach you nonetheless, asking for you maybe to contribute to their project. How are you what's the best way that you handle that?
Well, when I first started off 10 years ago, I was so eager for any kind of project. I did a lot of things for free.
Right.
And at some point, maybe 5 years into that, I got a little burned out. I realized I'd taken on a little too much and stretched myself a little too thin. So then I started to be a little bit more cautious, just to really to respect that I have enough time to work on each project.
So important.
Because if I take on too much, then I'm stretching my ideas thin, and each thing is gonna suffer from that a little bit, I think. So, I try to find a way to describe that sort of thing to people without in a respectful way, and most people understand, that if there's no budget, they can't realistically expect you to put aside time. But there's the cases when I do stuff for free nowadays, they're usually more often than not people that I know, and people that have somehow, maybe they do something that's a bit of a favor for me somehow.
Right.
It's more like there's some kind of exchange going on.
Yes.
But yeah, it just depends on the request, but I do try to get back to everyone who reaches out to me, and oftentimes what I'll do if someone has no budget is I'll tell them to go through my back catalog and maybe try and put in some of that music, and as long as the film stays a low budget thing, that they can just use that music. But maybe if the film starts to generate some income, then we get back in touch and talk about a way to share some of that income.
It's interesting that reminds me of are you aware of when Moby, and this is maybe just a few years ago, Moby put up a website called, I think it's Moby Gratis, and basically what he did was he took like 90% of his entire catalog and put it up on the website, and basically made it so anybody who's students, nonprofits, NGOs, artists, anybody who wasn't, if you wanted to use the music that wasn't for a profit sort of venture or a profit-seeking venture, you could apply to him or apply to Moby Gratis. You'd simply send, through the website, and he would respond to you generally within a day or two on whether or not you could use his music. And again, 90% of the time, it was a yes, and the idea was, however, if it does start to generate some more income, or you intend for this to make some income at that point, then we need to, we'll discuss that.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that as a musician?
I think that's a terrific idea. I feel like I do a similar thing myself without having that website,
Right.
Because why not? If someone wants to use your song and they've made a film, a creative endeavor, but it doesn't generate any income, why would you ask? There's no money there for anybody anyway, so
Right.
why ask for any? But it's fair enough to say, if this project starts to generate income, let's get together and talk about this again. And I think that's such a nice, trusting way to go about things, rather than get a contract in place from the start on a tiny, low budget project. That you just trust each other.
Yeah.
And agree to readdress it if the situation changes.
One of the things that I'm sort of particularly, I don't know if particularly proud of is the right way to state this, but years ago, and when I say years ago, it's probably at this point 2004-ish. I had worked on my first documentary. I was hired by another Portland filmmaker, and we went and spent 6 months in Cambodia, essentially with a film called Bomb Hunters, and we were filming basically the rural segment of the population, which was spending time digging up essentially old mortars and bombs and rockets from 30 years of civil war and the American bombing during the Vietnam War. And,
Wow.
and they were essentially taking these rockets and bombs and trying to disassemble them to separate the TNT and the metal, and to sell the metal on the scrap trade. And we were sort of following this trade that they were a part of. And at the time, Godspeed You Black Emperor had recently come out with what's the album, Yankee UXO. Which was all like, and if you looked at the album cover, it was like unexploded ordnance all over the place, and all the major corporations that were linked to money that went through defense funds and right. Basically war machines. And it's funny because I used one or two songs as a temp track for a couple of scenes. And the director, because the director had hired me to edit the film afterwards when we came back to the States, and the director liked it so much that we just sent an email out to I don't know if it was Ephraim or who it was from Godspeed, but we just sent an email to one of these guys. Total shot in the dark, right? Because of course at that time, I'm sure you're well acquainted with Godspeed, and they were kind of, certainly at that time, this sort of anarchic sort of group of musicians out of Montreal that you really didn't know where they resided or who was in the band, who wasn't, and how you could ever get a hold of them. And they didn't do score work at all. In fact, they were pretty against it at that point. And we just thought, what the hell, shot in the dark. And we sent an email, and within 24 hours, one of the band members had written us back, and he basically was like, look, you may or may not know this. We don't normally do movies at all. But yours sounds like a pretty important social cause, so go ahead and use these two songs, and if and when you ever make any kind of money on it, just go ahead and cut us a check, whatever you think it's worth. And it was just like, no way.
That's great, but in a sense, it's also not too surprising, right?
Right.
Because it's like, right, someone puts their money where their mouth is, sort of like.
Yeah, that's right.
Someone's willing to sort of give for the cause that they claim, in a sense.
It is, and that's exactly what that felt like, so. That was kind of a cool little anecdote I thought I'd share with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Peter, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm so glad that we were able to connect. How can my listeners get a hold of some of your music? What's the best way for them to get some of your music?
Well, you mentioned Spotify earlier. I don't have a Spotify account myself, so I don't know what that looks like, but I do believe that a good amount of my music is on there.
Right.
The only web thing that I do myself nowadays is an old-fashioned website.
Yeah.
It's peterbroderick.net. Believe it or not, peterbroderick.com will lead you to a filmmaker called Peter
I
Broderick.
was going to ask you if you knew about him. Yes.
I know about him from my Google mistakes.
I'll bet.
But yeah. But yeah, peterbroderick.net is my website, and you can find me there.
And after listening to your music and becoming more acquainted with this, I'm sure I would not be surprised if, who knows, maybe a listener or two will reach out to you in the future to do some work.
Well, feel free.
Yes, it's incredible music. I'm happy to hear your story, Peter. And yeah, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad you took the time to sort of highlight the music part of a film, because it may not seem like the most important part sometimes, but it deserves its own space to be talked about like this. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Don't forget, we'd love to have you join us in the Documentary Academy. Come and take a look at how we can help you make your best documentary film at thedocumentarylife.com/academy. That's thedocumentarylife.com/academy. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Reason, drawing fiction into faith at every turn. Fall to conclusions as they gather and disperse. Call on you and call on me in this old time. Call on this old time. Call on this old time. Shame on this old time. Shame on this old time.
Thanks again for listening to the show, and remember to like and subscribe to this channel. Also, remember, for any of the URLs that may or may not be outdated, and you want to get the most up-to-date information, perhaps for the documentary filmmaking courses, for the blog, for other episodes, just go ahead and check in the show notes below on this YouTube page, and that'll give you the correct URLs to use. Thanks again. Have a great day.